Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back in time, all the way to a place that feels both familiar and profoundly foreign, the heart of the Roman Empire. Now, I want you to close your eyes, if you feel comfortable, and imagine you're standing on the Appian Way. The sun is setting, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple, and you can hear the faint sounds of a bustling city in the distance, the murmur of a million voices, the low hum of cartwheels on cobblestones, maybe a stray dog barking somewhere. The air is thick with the smell of olive oil, stale wine, and a hint of wood smoke from 100 dinner fires. You feel safe, secure, because you are a citizen of the most powerful, most organized, and most enduring empire the world has ever known. You probably won't survive this era for very long. What with the lack of antibiotics and all, but for a moment, just imagine you do. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening tonight, why not let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, you're standing in the midst of a golden age, a period known as the Pax Romana. This Roman peace was, for over 200 years, a time of unprecedented stability and prosperity. From the reign of Augustus, which began in 27 BC, all the way to the reign of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the empire was a single, largely unified entity. You could travel from Britain to Syria and speak the same language, trade with the same currency, and live under the same legal system. The roads were safe, the pirates were gone, and the legions stood guard on the borders, a seemingly impenetrable shield against the world outside. This is a mainstream historical fact that you learn in school, a highlight reel of Roman greatness. But even in this era of magnificent peace and stunning public works, if you look closely, the cracks were already starting to show. The Pax Romana was less a natural state of being and more a gilded cage, built on a shaky foundation. The empire had become so vast that it was, in a way, too big to succeed. Take, for example, a quirky tidbit about Roman life: the sheer cost of maintaining an empire of this size. The Roman postal service, the cursus publicus, was an incredible feat of logistics, allowing official messages to travel hundreds of miles a day. But it was also a massive drain on the treasury, requiring countless horses, stables, and workers. It was the ancient equivalent of a nationwide overnight shipping service, and just as costly. Every mile of road had to be maintained, every border fortress supplied, every legionary paid. This was a massive, sprawling bureaucracy, and as with any bureaucracy, it was rife with inefficiency and corruption. It was like trying to manage a modern, multinational corporation with nothing but papyrus scrolls and a few abacuses. The system worked, but just barely, and its immense weight was something the empire could only bear when everything was going perfectly. As we'll see, things would very soon stop being perfect. Historians still argue whether the seeds of Rome's eventual decline were sown during this period of apparent strength. Was the reliance on slave labor a ticking time bomb? Did the constant wars of expansion, which had ended by the time of the Pax Romana, create a legion of restless soldiers with nothing to do? Some scholars suggest the very prosperity of the era led to a kind of societal complacency, a quiet belief that this way of life would simply continue forever. The truth is, The empire was a complex and fragile organism. When you build something so grand and so wide, there are a million tiny points of failure. The political stability, for instance, rested entirely on the personality and competence of a single man, the emperor. When you have a series of good emperors, everything hums along. When you have a series of less than stellar emperors, well, that's when things start to get interesting. The problem was that there was no clear constitutional line of succession. This was not a hereditary monarchy in the modern sense. An emperor could adopt his heir, or a powerful general could simply declare himself the new leader. This system worked when you had a strong, benevolent leader who could choose a worthy successor, like Hadrian or Antoninus Pius. But what happens when that system breaks down? Picture yourself, a Roman citizen, standing in the middle of all this. You're not a philosopher or a general. You're just a person trying to make a living. You have a small shop, maybe, or you're a farmer. For you, the Pax Romana means you don't have to worry about an invading army showing up at your door. You can count on the roads being safe for your goods, and you know the local magistrate will probably be fair. The stability is a gentle, comforting blanket. You're lulled into a sense of permanence. The empire is a constant, an unshakable force. The great monuments of Rome, like the Colosseum and the Pantheon, were built during this time, and they were built to last. A physical testament to the permanence of the Roman way of life. But beneath the polished marble and the grand arches, the foundations were already starting to shift. The gentle hum of Roman life was about to be replaced by the jarring sound of civil war, a sound that would echo through the years and slowly, inevitably, lead to the quiet fading of a truly remarkable civilization. So, you've enjoyed the comfort of the Pax Romana, a period where things were, for the most part, predictable. The emperor was a known quantity, the borders were solid, and the tax collector, while annoying, was at least predictable. But now, as we slide past the peaceful reign of Marcus Aurelius, things are about to get messy. The year is 180 AD, and you, a hard-working citizen in a place like Gaul or Egypt, are starting to hear whispers. Whispers of plots, whispers of assassinations, and whispers of what's called the crisis of the 3rd century. This isn't a slow, gentle hum of change. This is a jarring, chaotic cacophony of civil war and political instability, and it's about to last for the better part of 50 years. The big, mainstream historical fact of this era is that the Roman Empire was suddenly plunged into an almost continuous state of civil war. The period between 235 AD and 284 AD saw at least 26 different men officially declared emperor, and that's not even counting all the short-lived pretenders and regional usurpers. It was like a game of musical chairs, but instead of losing your seat, you lost your head. The average reign for these so-called barracks emperors was barely 2 years. Imagine having a new CEO of your company every 2 years. Now, imagine that every time a new CEO took over, they had to fight a bloody war to do it. The entire system of governance broke down. Instead of a strong, centralized power in Rome, you had rival generals in distant provinces, each with the loyalty of their legions, each believing he was the rightful heir to the purple robes. Here's a quirky tidbit to bring it to life. During the reign of the Emperor Philip the Arabaman, so named because he was from the province of Arabia, which today would be part of Syria, celebrated its 1000th birthday in 248 AD with a massive festival. The games were lavish and spectacular. a final, desperate show of strength. But even as the crowds cheered and 1,000 lions were slaughtered in the Colosseum, the empire was already in a state of advanced decay. Just a few months later, rebellions broke out on the Danube frontier, and Philip himself was killed in battle by a rival general. It was a classic example of fiddling while Rome burned, or, more accurately, throwing a massive birthday party while the house was falling down around you. The sheer spectacle was a distraction from the deep rot at the core. This period is still a major point of debate among scholars. Historians still argue whether the crisis of the 3rd century was a symptom of a pre-existing decline, or if it was the cause of the decline itself. Was the empire already so weak that it was ripe for this kind of upheaval? Or did the upheaval itself shatter the empire beyond repair? Some point to the plague that swept through the empire in the middle of the century, the plague of Cyprian, which is estimated to have killed thousands and decimated the population, weakening both the economy and the military. Other scholars emphasize the economic pressures, the constant need to pay the soldiers, which led to rampant inflation and the debasement of the currency. The silver content in Roman coins dropped so low that they were barely worth the metal they were stamped on. For you, the ordinary Roman, this chaos was more than just a headline. The civil wars meant that the legions, who were supposed to be guarding the borders, were often fighting each other. This left the frontiers undefended, and for the first time in a long time, the barbarians, the Goths, the Franks, the Alemannists started to cross the Rhine and Danube rivers in force. They weren't just raiding, they were invading, burning down towns and carrying off plunder. You might have found yourself living in a Roman city, a city that was once completely safe, now surrounded by newly built defensive walls. The very act of building walls around cities that had been open for centuries was a quiet admission that the Pax Romana was over. The state was no longer protecting you. The constant need to pay and placate the soldiers meant that the emperors were forced to raise taxes, and they had to be paid in gold or silver that was becoming increasingly scarce. This led to a vicious cycle. The more they raised taxes, the more the economy suffered. The more the economy suffered, the more desperate the people became. The more desperate the people became, the more likely they were to support a new general who promised to solve all their problems. And then, that new general would become emperor, only to be killed 2 years later by the next general. It was exhausting, a non-stop cycle of hope and bloodshed. So, as the world around you becomes unstable, and you look at your worthless coin, you might start to wonder what happened to that great empire you grew up in, the one with the beautiful aqueducts and the safe roads. It's still there, technically, but it feels different. The comfort and predictability you once knew are gone, replaced by a constant, low-level anxiety. You might hear the tramp of legionaries' feet on the cobblestones, and instead of feeling reassured, you might feel a knot of fear in your stomach because you don't know whose side they're on, or if they're even going to get paid. You might even hear them speaking a different language, a sign of the empire's new reliance on foreign-born soldiers. The slow, gentle hum of prosperity has been replaced by the roar of battle, and the empire is starting to feel less like a single, unified state, and more like a collection of warring factions. The chaos of the crisis of the 3rd century, with its revolving door of emperors, wasn't just random bad luck. It was the natural outcome of a system that had become dangerously top-heavy and decentralized. You see, the power no longer rested in Rome with the Senate, or even in the traditional concept of an imperial dynasty. No, the power had shifted, and it had shifted to the front lines, to the men who held the swords. This is the era of the soldier emperors, and it's a time when you really didn't want to be a powerful, ambitious general. Because if you were, you had a decent chance of becoming emperor, and an even better chance of being killed by the next ambitious general. The mainstream historical fact here is that the military, which was supposed to be the empire's protector, became its ultimate arbiter of power. The legions stationed in far-flung provinces Britain, Gaul, Syria, along the Danube began to feel a stronger loyalty to their immediate commander than to the distant and often unknown emperor back in Rome. When a general won a significant victory or simply had the support of his troops, it was a very small step for him to have his soldiers raise him up on a shield and declare him Augustus. This was a direct, brutal form of popular election, and it created a cycle of violence. An emperor would take power by force, often by marching on Rome with his army. He would then have to raise taxes and debase the currency to pay his loyal troops, which would anger the civilian population. A few years later, another general, seeing the emperor's unpopularity and feeling his own ambition stir, would do the exact same thing. It was a vicious cycle of violence and instability, a sort of Emperor of the Month club that no one really wanted to be a part of. Now for a quirky tidbit: to become a soldier emperor, all you really needed was the support of your troops. One of the more famous of these was a man named Maximinus Thrax. He wasn't a noble or a senator. He was a Thracian peasant who had worked his way up through the ranks because of his immense size and strength. The Roman historian Herodian describes him as a man of such great stature that he was 8 feet tall and so strong he could pull a cart on his own. It's a fun story, and it's almost certainly exaggerated, but it illustrates a fundamental shift. You didn't have to be a Roman noble to rule Rome anymore. The political elite were being sidelined by men who had mud on their boots and calluses on their hands. This was a more meritocratic system in a way, but one based on military prowess, not good governance. It was a terrifying reality check for the old Roman aristocracy, who had always assumed that power was their birthright. The very nature of this era is a subject of intense debate among scholars. Historians still argue whether the soldier emperors were the last gasp of a dying political system, or if they were a kind of messy, violent adaptation to a new reality. Was the traditional system of governance so broken that this was the only way to get anything done? Some historians suggest that the soldier emperors, for all their faults, were the men who were actually on the ground, fighting the empire's enemies. They were a more responsive leadership, even if they were also incredibly silly. They were men of action in a time that required it. But this adaptation came at a price: the total breakdown of civilian authority and the rule of law. It meant that every man with a sword was a potential king, and the word of the emperor was only as good as the loyalty of the legions. Imagine you're a merchant living in a small city in the Roman province of Pannonia. You remember the good old days of the Pax Romana, and you watch with a sort of morbid fascination as the news comes in. Another emperor has been killed. Another general has taken his place. Each new leader demands more taxes, more supplies for his troops. The roads, which were once so safe, are now dangerous, patrolled by either bandits or soldiers of a rival faction. You have to pay tribute to local warlords to ensure your safety. Your world is shrinking. The idea of a single, unified empire seems more and more like a distant memory, a story told by your grandparents. The sense of belonging to a vast, glorious civilization is being replaced by a sense of isolation and constant threat. You might even find yourself paying your taxes not to Rome, but to a local general who promises to protect you, even if that protection is temporary and comes with a very high price. The era of the soldier emperors was a symptom of Rome's fundamental problem, an empire that was too large and too complex for its political system to handle. The military, which was meant to be a tool of the state, had become the state itself. The slow, gentle decline was now accelerating, propelled by the brute force of men who cared more about their own power than about the long-term stability of a civilization they were, in their own way, slowly tearing apart. After the relentless chaos of the soldier emperors, with its constant battles and ever-changing leadership, you, as a Roman citizen, would have yearned for some stability. The constant fear of civil war and foreign invasion was exhausting. You remember the old days when the borders were strong and the streets of Rome felt safe. Well, a new emperor, a man named Aurelian, will give you a stark, physical reminder that those days are gone forever. We're talking about the Aurelian Wall, and its construction signals a monumental psychological shift for the empire. The mainstream historical fact is that in the late 270s AD, the Emperor Aurelian began the construction of a massive defensive wall around the city of Rome. This was a colossal project, a 9-mile-long stone barrier that stood over 25 feet tall with hundreds of towers. Now, think about this for a moment. For nearly 500 years, since the days of the Republic, the city of Rome had not needed a defensive wall. It was the heart of an empire that had no equal. The idea of an enemy army marching on the capital was unthinkable. But the crisis of the 3rd century, with its barbarian invasions and civil wars, had changed everything. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a visible, silent admission that the empire was no longer an expanding, unstoppable force. It was now a defensive one, hunkering down and trying to hold on to what it had. The construction of the wall was like the empire putting up a big, "We're closed" sign on its front door. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Aurelian Wall. Aurelian was so pressed for time and resources that he incorporated existing buildings into the wall's structure. You might have seen the wall cutting straight through someone's house, or a temple, or even an aqueduct. The Romans, known for their meticulous engineering, were now so desperate they were just bricking over everything and hoping it held. It's a hilarious, if tragic, example of late-stage imperial resourcefulness. Imagine a historical preservation committee today trying to get that through. The wall itself was a Frankenstein's monster of Roman architecture, a patchwork of old and new, and a perfect metaphor for the patchwork state of the empire itself. It was a clear sign that the old glory days of building magnificent, soaring structures for beauty and public use were over. The new priority was simple: survival. This era of transition is a key point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Aurelian Wall was a symbol of Rome's decline, or if it was a necessary and logical response to a changing world. Was Aurelian a visionary leader who saw the need for a new defensive posture, or was he simply an emperor who was forced to build a wall because he was a failure? Some scholars argue that the wall and the shift to a more defensive mindset actually helped the empire survive for another 200 years. They see it as a pragmatic solution to a complex problem. Others view it as the final, sad act of a dying empire, an admission that its old power was gone forever. It's a debate that gets to the heart of what the decline of Rome actually was: a collapse or a slow, grinding transformation. For you, living in Rome, the wall would have been an ever-present feature of your daily life. It would have been a constant reminder of the threats beyond the gates. The sounds of construction would have filled the air for years. The sight of the towering stone, a daily source of both reassurance and anxiety. You might have watched as your favorite local tavern was demolished to make way for the wall, or a familiar shrine became part of a fortified tower. The world outside the wall, which was once your empire, now feels foreign and dangerous. You know that beyond those gates are the Goths, the Franks, and a host of other groups that you once thought of as simple barbarians, but now know can sack your cities and kill your leaders. The wall solidified a new reality. The Roman army, once an engine of conquest, was now an army of defense. The purpose of the state was no longer to expand and bring civilization to new lands. Its purpose was now to protect what was left. The gentle hum of the Pax Romana had been replaced by the rhythmic clang of hammers on stone, and the scraping sound of 1,000 workers building a monument to the empire's newfound vulnerability. The empire was not yet dead, not by a long shot, but it was no longer on offense. It was on defense, and it was digging in for a long, slow, grinding fight for survival. The crisis of the 3rd century, with its endless parade of soldier emperors and the constant threat of invasion, was a terrifying period. It was a time of pure chaos, and as we've seen, chaos is exhausting. So, when a new emperor named Diocletian finally took power in 284 AD, he was faced with a monumental task. How do you fix an empire that is, for all intents and purposes, broken? His solution was radical, and it marks a fundamental shift in the empire's structure. We're talking about Diocletian's big, bold fix, and it was anything but subtle. The mainstream historical fact about Diocletian's reign is his introduction of the Tetrarchy, or rule of 4. He looked at the empire, which had become a patchwork of warring provinces and undefended frontiers, and he made a simple, elegant observation. One man couldn't possibly rule it all. It was too vast, too complex, and too dangerous. So he decided to split it. He divided the empire into a western and an eastern half, and then appointed a co-emperor, or Augustus, to rule the west. But wait, there's more. To solve the problem of succession and to create a clear line of authority, each Augustus was to have a junior emperor, or Caesar, who would be his designated heir. The Caesar would assist the Augustus in ruling his half of the empire. And when the Augustus retired or died, the Caesar would take over, and a new Caesar would be appointed. It was a beautiful, logical, and deeply Roman solution to a very Roman problem. Here's a quirky tidbit about Diocletian himself. He wasn't a Roman noble. He was a commoner from Dalmatia, a region in what is now Croatia. This was a trend we saw with the soldier emperors, but Diocletian was different. He didn't just want power for himself. He genuinely wanted to fix the empire. He was a pragmatist, not a glory seeker, and his reforms went far beyond just the Tetrarchy. He also implemented massive economic changes to fight the rampant inflation we talked about earlier. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a decree that set price controls on thousands of goods and services, from eggs to lawyers' fees. He was trying to bring order to a chaotic economy. It didn't work very well. People just traded on the black market instead. But the sheer scale of the attempt shows just how badly he wanted to fix things. He was a man who believed in top-down solutions to everything, and he was not afraid to micromanage a continent. The impact of his reforms is still a topic of intense scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Diocletian's reforms were a final, brilliant act of preservation that bought the empire another 200 years, or if they were the beginning of the end by cementing the division of the empire. Did he save the empire, or did he simply formalize its decline? Some scholars see the Tetrarchy as a necessary surgical procedure, a painful but ultimately life-saving operation that cut away the unmanageable parts of the empire and allowed the rest to function. Others argue that by splitting the empire in two, he created two separate rival power centers, ensuring that the two halves would eventually drift apart and become separate entities entirely. For you, the everyday person, this would have been a fascinating and confusing time. You would have had not one, but 4 emperors. There was Diocletian, the senior Augustus, in the east, and his Caesar in the east. And then there was the Augustus of the west, and his Caesar of the west. Suddenly, your empire feels bigger, and yet smaller at the same time. The local administration would have been more efficient because the emperors were closer to the borders and could respond to threats more quickly. But the taxes would have been just as high, if not higher, because you now had 4 imperial courts to support, 4 armies to pay, and 4 sets of massive building projects to fund. You'd see a new wave of bureaucratic complexity, a sort of bureaucratic nightmare of a new kind. You remember the old bureaucracy with its papyrus scrolls and abacuses. Well, this new bureaucracy would have been a lot bigger, a lot more rigid, and a lot more invasive in your daily life. Diocletian's reforms were a testament to the idea that Rome's problems could be solved through sheer force of will and intelligent organization. He was a man who saw the empire as a machine, and he believed that if he just replaced the broken parts and re-engineered the whole thing, it would work again. And for a little while, it did. The Tetrarchy brought a much-needed period of stability to the empire. The constant civil wars of the 3rd century came to a halt. The frontiers, which had been overrun by barbarians, were shored up. The empire took a deep, shuddering breath. But Diocletian's fix, as brilliant as it was ultimately built on a foundation of human ambition. And, as you might have guessed, that's a very difficult thing to control. The new system was about to face a very old problem: human nature. Diocletian's Tetrarchy, with its 4-part leadership, was a marvel of political engineering. For a while, it actually worked. The empire had a clear line of succession, the borders were more secure, and the constant threat of civil war receded. But as we all know, even the most elegant plans often run into the messy, unpredictable reality of human ambition. The system was designed to prevent conflict, but it was also designed by a man who had more power than anyone in the empire. What happens when that system is put to the test? This is where we explore the Tetrarchy and its awkward problems. Because despite its brilliant design, it was inherently unstable. The mainstream historical fact here is that Diocletian's grand experiment fell apart almost as soon as he retired. In 305 AD, in a move that shocked everyone, Diocletian became the first Roman emperor to voluntarily give up power. He forced his coadjutor Maximian to do the same. The 2 Caesars became the new Augusти, and a new set of Caesars were appointed. The system, for a moment, had worked exactly as intended. But Maximian's son, Maxentius, and one of the new Caesars, A man named Constantine, who happened to be the son of another Augustus, had other ideas. They both wanted more power. The peaceful transfer of power quickly degenerated into a series of bloody civil wars that lasted for years. The empire was once again a battlefield, and Diocletian's carefully constructed political machine was torn to shreds. Here's a quirky tidbit about Diocletian's retirement. After giving up the greatest office in the world, he went back to his home in Dalmatia and became a cabbage farmer. When his old emperor, Maximian, tried to convince him to come back to power and help fix the mess they had created, Diocletian famously replied that if Maximian could only see the magnificent cabbages he had grown with his own hands, he would never ask him to leave. It's a perfect illustration of the man's character, a pragmatist who, having done his duty, was perfectly content to retire to a quiet life. But the seeds he had sown, both literal and metaphorical, were far from peaceful. The very idea of having 4 emperors created 4 distinct centers of power, and with power comes ambition. Historians still argue whether the Tetrarchy's failure was inevitable due to the nature of human ambition, or if it was simply doomed by the personal rivalries of the men involved. Some scholars suggest that the system, with its clear hierarchy and peaceful succession, was a genuine innovation that might have worked if the men who inherited it had been less greedy. Others argue that any system that gives a person the title Augustus and an army to go with it is just asking for trouble. It created a situation where 4 men were, in effect, 4 kings of the same kingdom, and that's a political arrangement that has almost never worked in history. The division of the empire, which was supposed to solve the problem of its size, instead created for smaller, more intense battlegrounds for power. For you, the ordinary Roman, this political turmoil would have been a terrible throwback to the crisis of the 3rd century. You'd probably heard about Diocletian's reforms and breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, a plan. Finally, stability. And then, a few years later, the tax collector shows up again, demanding more money for a new war. You hear rumors of legions clashing with legions, of one emperor's army marching against another's. The hard-won peace is gone, replaced by a new kind of internecine warfare. The empire, which was supposed to be a unified, functional entity, is once again tearing itself apart from the inside. The grand, logical plan of Diocletian had one fatal flaw. It relied on the assumption that powerful, ambitious men would willingly share power and follow a predetermined plan for succession. But the very thing that made these men powerful, their ambition, was the same thing that made them unwilling to play by the rules. The Tetrarchy, for all its genius, was a temporary stopgap, a brilliant band-aid on a mortal wound. It brought a brief period of quiet, a moment where the empire could catch its breath, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. The slow, gentle hum of decline was interrupted, but it wasn't stopped. And in the aftermath of the Tetrarchy's collapse, one man would rise from the ashes, and he would not just change the empire, he would change the very soul of the Western world. This man, as you might have guessed, was Constantine, and his story is far from boring. The collapse of the Tetrarchy, with its 4 emperors vying for control, was a time of great violence and uncertainty. It seemed like the Roman Empire was doomed to repeat the chaotic cycle of the 3rd century forever. But out of this chaos, one man, a former Caesar from the Tetrarchy, would emerge victorious. This man was Constantine, and his rise to power wasn't just a political victory, it was a spiritual one too. We're going to talk about Constantine's convenient conversion and how a single battle in the year 312 AD changed the course of European history forever. The mainstream historical fact here is that Constantine, on the eve of the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge, had a vision. He saw a Christian symbol, the Chiro, in the sky, and heard a voice instructing him to place the symbol on his soldiers' shields. He did, and he won the battle, defeating his rival, Maxentus, and gaining control of the Western Roman Empire. From that point on, Constantine became a patron of Christianity. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which legalized Christianity and restored all confiscated church property. It was a stunning reversal of policy. Just a few years earlier, under Diocletian, Christians had been brutally persecuted, and now they were not only tolerated but embraced by the most powerful man in the world. Here's a quirky tidbit about Constantine's Christianity. Historians still aren't sure how sincere he was. He wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed, many years after his supposed vision. Throughout his life, he continued to pay homage to the Roman sun god Sol Invictus, even putting the sun god on his coins. It's possible that his conversion was a savvy political move, a way to gain the support of the large and growing Christian population in the empire. It's also possible that his faith was genuine, but that he saw no contradiction in also honoring the traditional Roman gods. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but whatever the reason, the effect was profound. Christianity, which had been a persecuted minority religion, was now on the fast track to becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Historians still argue whether Constantine's conversion was a pivotal turning point for the empire, or if it was simply the formal recognition of a change that was already happening. Some scholars argue that Constantine's embrace of Christianity fundamentally changed the empire's character, shifting it from a pagan state with a pantheon of gods to a Christian state with a single god. This new, unifying religion provided a powerful new source of cohesion in a fractured world. Other historians argue that Christianity was already so widespread in the empire that it was an unstoppable force. Constantine simply recognized the inevitable and positioned himself on the winning side. It's a debate that gets to the heart of the role of a single person in shaping historical events. For you, a Roman citizen, the rise of Christianity would have been a massive change to your daily life. You remember the old days when the state religion was an integral part of your life. The festivals, the sacrifices, the pantheon of gods for every occasion. Remember that quirky story from before about the Roman postal service? Well, a new emperor who believes in a single god changes everything. The old temples might start to fall into disrepair, and new, smaller places of worship called churches might start to pop up. Your neighbors, who had been practicing their religion in secret, were now out in the open, and they were gaining power and influence. You might even find yourself, as an ambitious young man, having to convert to Christianity to get ahead in the imperial bureaucracy. It was a new world, a world where the old gods were slowly being forgotten and a new, single deity was taking their place. The convenience of Constantine's conversion, whether it was genuine or not, was that it gave the empire a new sense of purpose. The old unifying force of the empire's shared pagan religion, its shared culture, its shared sense of Roman superiority was gone. In its place, Constantine offered a new unifying force, a new shared religion. It was a clever move, a way to replace a fractured and outdated belief system with a new, vibrant one. But this new, vibrant system was not without its own problems. The theological debates of the early Christians were every bit as brutal and as divisive as the political rivalries of the soldier emperors. The empire was no longer a pagan one, but it was not yet a truly peaceful Christian one either. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now colored by the solemn chant of Christian monks and the loud, often angry, sound of theological debates. Constantine's reign was a time of immense change, and his embrace of Christianity was just one part of a larger plan to fix a fractured empire. His most audacious move, however, wasn't religious. It was geographic. He looked at the old capital of Rome, a city steeped in tradition and pagan temples, and decided that it was no longer the right place to run an empire that was increasingly centered in the East. This brings us to moving the capital to Constantinople, a decision that created a new, vibrant heart for the empire, but also a new, debilitating imbalance. The mainstream historical fact is that in 330 AD, Constantine founded a new capital city, a magnificent new city built on the site of an old Greek town called Byzantium. He renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The location was a stroke of genius. Situated on a peninsula with a magnificent natural harbor, it was at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the sea lanes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was a perfect, defensible location for an empire that was increasingly focused on the wealthy eastern provinces and the constant threat from Persia. He lavished money on the new city, building forums, baths, and magnificent churches. It was, in effect, a new Rome, a city built from scratch to be a Christian capital for a Christian empire. Here's a quirky tidbit about Constantinople's construction. Constantine took statues and artwork from all over the empire to decorate his new city. He didn't just commission new stuff. He simply took things from old pagan temples and public spaces in Rome and other cities and shipped them east. The city was a magnificent, if somewhat haphazard, collection of Roman greatness. Imagine your local city hall today being decorated with the art from a museum in a different city. It's a bit of a strange concept, but it shows just how much he wanted to make Constantinople feel like the new, true capital of the empire. The message was clear. The old Rome was a city of the past. The new Rome was here, and it was glorious. Historians still argue whether the founding of Constantinople was the first step in the final, formal division of the Roman Empire, or if it was a brilliant and necessary move that ensured the survival of the eastern half. Some scholars see it as a strategic masterstroke. The Eastern Empire was richer, more urbanized, and less exposed to barbarian invasions than the West. By moving the capital there, Constantine put the government where the money and power were. It was a logical move that ensured the empire would survive in some form, even if the western half eventually fell. Other historians see it as a betrayal of Rome, a severing of the empire's soul. By creating a new capital, Constantine created a rival power center, ensuring that the two halves of the empire would eventually drift apart, not just geographically, but culturally and politically as well. For you, a Roman citizen living in Rome, the move would have been a bitter pill to swallow. The city you lived in, the heart of the empire for over 1,000 years, was now being slowly stripped of its power and prestige. The old Senate was still there, but its power was a shadow of its former self. The emperors who had once lived in the city were now thousands of miles away, ruling from a new city on the Bosporus. The resources, the trade, and the best people were all heading east, and your city was becoming, in a way, a backwater. The slow, gentle decline of Rome was no longer just a financial or political problem. It was a psychological one, too. The city was still beautiful, but it was starting to feel like a museum, a relic of a past greatness. The decision to move the capital to Constantinople was a watershed moment. It was a sign that the old Roman world, with its focus on the Mediterranean and the city of Rome, was over. The new Roman world was a Christian one, and it was centered in the East. This new city would go on to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium as it would later be known, for another 1,000 years after the West had fallen. It was a testament to Constantine's vision and to the fact that sometimes the best way to save something is to abandon a part of it. The empire was changing, and it was changing in a way that would make a peaceful, united empire less and less likely. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet whisper, fading from the old city and traveling eastward to a new, magnificent city built on the sea. As the empire transitioned into a new era under Constantine, with its new religion and new capital, you might have felt a sense of relief. The chaos of the 3rd century was over, and a new, more stable order seemed to be taking hold. But beneath the surface of this newfound political stability, the old problems of the empire were still very much alive. The sheer cost of running such a massive state was astronomical, and the average citizen was the one who was going to pay for it. This is where we discuss the economic squeeze and its consequences, a slow, grinding decline that made life harder for everyone. The mainstream historical fact is that the Roman economy in the later empire was plagued by crippling inflation and an ever-increasing tax burden. The constant wars of the previous century had drained the imperial treasury. The endless need to pay the army to build new roads and fortifications, and to fund the lavish new capital of Constantinople meant that the emperors were always looking for money. They had already debased the currency so much that the coins were nearly worthless, so they resorted to a more direct and brutal method, taxation. The government became more and more efficient at extracting wealth from its citizens. The Roman state, which had once been a source of stability, was now becoming a grinding, oppressive machine of taxation. Here's a quirky tidbit about Roman taxes. They weren't just paid in money, they were often paid in kind. If you were a farmer, you might have to give a portion of your grain harvest to the state. If you were a craftsman, you might have to provide a certain number of your finished products. This system, known as unknona, was a way for the government to directly feed and supply the army and the capital cities without having to deal with a broken monetary system. Imagine you've just had a great harvest and you're looking forward to feeding your family. Then the tax collector shows up and takes a third of your grain. It was a deeply inefficient and often corrupt system that made it nearly impossible for the average person to get ahead. It was like paying your rent with chickens and hoping the landlord didn't decide they were too scrawny. Historians still argue whether the economic problems of the late empire were a cause of the empire's decline, or if they were simply a symptom of its other problems. Some scholars point to the economic collapse as the single most important factor. They argue that when an economy can no longer support its military and its bureaucracy, the state is bound to fail. The Roman state was, in their view, a victim of its own success. It had grown so large and so complex that the economic base could no longer support its weight. Other historians argue that the economic problems were simply a result of the political instability and the barbarian invasions. They suggest that if the empire had been politically stable and militarily secure, it would have been able to solve its economic problems. It's a debate that gets to the heart of the relationship between a state's economy and its overall health. For you, an ordinary Roman citizen, the economic squeeze would have been a daily source of anxiety. You would have seen your neighbors abandoning their farms and their businesses because the tax burden was too great. The local tax collectors, who were responsible for meeting their quotas, often resorted to brutal and oppressive tactics to get the money. Many people simply fled, becoming tenant farmers on the great estates of the wealthy landowners, where they could at least get some protection from the tax collector. The old class distinctions became more rigid. The wealthy got wealthier, and the poor got poorer. The middle class, the backbone of the old empire, was slowly disappearing, squeezed out of existence by the twin pressures of inflation and taxation. The decline of the Roman Empire wasn't always a dramatic military event. Sometimes it was a quiet, economic one. It was the sound of a farmer giving up his land, the sound of a potter closing his shop, the sound of a family moving from a small city to the countryside to become a serf on a great estate. The vibrant, bustling urban centers of the Pax Romana were slowly shrinking, and the great cities were becoming hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The empire was becoming a place of vast, sprawling estates and a small, but incredibly wealthy, class of landowners, all of whom were protected from the economic chaos by their own wealth and power. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a low, rumbling sound in your stomach, a constant reminder that for all the glory and the power of the empire, you were just a person trying to make ends meet in a world that was becoming increasingly difficult to live in. The economic pressures and political instability of the late empire weren't just changing the lives of ordinary citizens. They were also having a profound effect on the Roman military, the very institution that was supposed to protect the empire from its enemies. We've already seen how the legions became the arbiters of power during the crisis of the 3rd century. But now we're going to discuss the seeds of military decline, a slow, almost imperceptible transformation that made the Roman army, once the most fearsome fighting force in the world, less Roman and less effective. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Roman army began to rely more and more on foreign-born soldiers, often from the very tribes they were fighting against. These so-called barbarians were enlisted into the Roman legions and often rose to positions of power, even becoming generals. This was a pragmatic solution to a very real problem. There simply weren't enough Roman citizens who were willing to join the army. The tax burden, the constant warfare, and the social stratification of the late empire meant that the old ideal of the citizen soldier, the farmer who would take up a sword to defend his land, was a thing of the past. The empire needed soldiers, and it was willing to get them from anywhere it could. Here's a quirky tidbit about this shift. The Romans began to adopt the military tactics and equipment of their enemies. The Roman army, once famous for its discipline, its gladius, and its massive, interlocking shields, began to adopt the longer swords, the chainmail, and the cavalry tactics of the Goths and other Germanic tribes. In a way, the Roman army was becoming barbarianized. They were, in effect, fighting their enemies by becoming them. It's a bit like a modern army adopting the technology of its adversaries, but in reverse. It shows a certain level of pragmatism, but it also shows a loss of a distinct Roman military identity. The soldiers who were fighting for the empire no longer looked and fought like the Roman legionaries of old. This profound change is a crucial point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the barbarianization of the Roman army was a sign of its strength and adaptability, or if it was a symptom of its terminal decline. Some scholars argue that this was a necessary and intelligent adaptation. The Roman army was no longer fighting for expansion, but for defense, and the new tactics and equipment were simply better suited to the new reality. They see the integration of foreign soldiers as a sign of the empire's continuing ability to absorb and assimilate other cultures. Other historians see it as a fatal weakness. They argue that when the army no longer shared the same language, culture, and loyalty as the state it was defending, it was only a matter of time before that loyalty would waver. The Roman army, in this view, was no longer a tool of the Roman state. It was a collection of mercenaries who would fight for whoever paid them the most. For you, a Roman citizen living near a frontier, this change would have been both reassuring and unsettling. The presence of a new garrison of soldiers would have been a relief, a sign that the empire was still defending you. But these soldiers might have spoken a different language, and they might have worshipped different gods. They might have had a different culture and a different way of life. The line between Roman and barbarian was becoming blurry, and for you, that would have been a strange and unsettling thing. You might have seen these foreign soldiers in the local tavern, heard them speaking in guttural tones, and wondered if the empire you knew was still the empire you were living in. The Roman military was, for a long time, the engine of the empire's success. It was the source of its power, its wealth, and its prestige. But as the empire began to decline, so too did its military. The old discipline, the old sense of duty, the old ideal of the Roman citizen soldier were slowly eroding. The military was still a powerful force, but it was a different kind of force. It was a force that was less and less tied to the Roman state and more tied to the personal loyalties of its commanders. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a muffled sound, the sound of a foreign army marching under a Roman eagle, a powerful symbol of an empire that was, in its own way, slowly fading away. The internal issues of the Roman Empire, the political chaos, the economic squeeze, the weakening of the military, were profound, but they weren't happening in a vacuum. The world beyond Rome's borders was also changing, and these changes were about to have a devastating impact on the empire. We're going to look at Gothic migrations and a new threat, a time when a massive, desperate population movement collided head-on with an empire that was too weak to absorb it. The mainstream historical fact is that in the late 4th century, a fierce, nomadic people from Central Asia, the Huns, began to move westward. Their advance created a domino effect, pushing the Germanic tribes that lived on the Roman frontier, particularly the Goths, to flee for their lives. The Goths, a large and powerful confederation of tribes, found themselves with nowhere to go. They were caught between the terrifying Huns and the powerful Roman Empire. In 376 AD, a massive number of Goths gathered on the banks of the Danube River, which was the border of the empire, and they pleaded with the emperor to let them in. They didn't want to invade. They just wanted to find a safe place to live within the Roman Empire. Here's a quirky tidbit about this migration. The Roman officials in charge of letting the Goths in were corrupt, lazy, and utterly unprepared. They were supposed to disarm the Goths, but instead, they took bribes to let them keep their weapons. They were also supposed to provide the Goths with food and shelter, but they were so corrupt that they often sold the Goths rotten food, or, in one particularly shocking story, sold them dog meat for an exorbitant price. The Goths, who were already desperate and starving, quickly became enraged. A humanitarian crisis quickly devolved into a major military and political one. The entire episode shows just how corrupt and inefficient the Roman bureaucracy had become. It was a failure of administration that had devastating consequences. Historians still argue whether the Goths' entry into the empire was a calculated betrayal by Rome, or if it was simply a colossal failure of a corrupt bureaucracy. Some scholars argue that the Roman officials were acting on their own, and that the central government in Constantinople would have wanted to handle the situation differently. In this view, the Roman state was still capable, but it was being undermined by its own incompetent and corrupt agents. Other historians argue that this was a deliberate act of betrayal. They suggest that the Romans, who were always suspicious of the barbarians, were simply trying to take advantage of the Goths' desperate situation. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. The Goths, who had entered the empire as refugees, were now on the brink of war with their hosts. For you, a Roman citizen living in the Balkans, this would have been a terrifying and confusing time. You would have seen a massive, almost incomprehensible number of people suddenly appear on the other side of the river. You would have heard rumors of their numbers, their desperation, and their eventual entry into the empire. At first, you might have felt a sense of pity. But as the Goths, who were now starving and armed, began to raid the local countryside for food, that pity would have quickly turned to fear. You would have seen your neighbors' farms burned, your towns plundered, and you would have asked yourself, why did we let them in? The security you had once felt, living on the border of a great empire, was now gone, replaced by the constant threat of a desperate and angry new population. The Gothic migrations were a wake-up call for an empire that had been coasting on its past glory. The old Roman policy of expansion and assimilation was no longer possible. The empire was too weak to absorb such a large number of people, and its bureaucracy was too corrupt to manage the situation. The Goths, who had once been a distant threat on the other side of the river, were now a massive armed presence within the empire's borders. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a low, rumbling sound. The sound of thousands of refugees' feet walking on Roman soil, and it was about to get a lot louder. The Gothic migrations were a disaster in the making, and it was only a matter of time before the tension between the desperate Goths and the incompetent Roman bureaucracy boiled over. The inevitable clash would not be a minor border skirmish, but a major, cataclysmic event that would shatter the Roman Empire's self-image forever. We're now going to look at the Battle of Adrianople and a massive shock, a single battle that proved, in the most brutal way possible, that the Roman army was no longer invincible. The mainstream historical fact is that in 378 AD, a massive Roman army, led by the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens himself, met a large Gothic army near the city of Adrianople. The Roman army was confident and well-equipped. The Goths were desperate and angry. The result was a total, unmitigated disaster for the Romans. The Roman army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. The Emperor Valens was killed in the battle, a shocking event in itself, as it was the first time in over 60 years that a Roman emperor had died in combat. The flower of the Roman Eastern army was destroyed, and the Goths were now a powerful, armed force running wild within the empire's borders. Here's a quirky tidbit about the battle. One of the things that helped the Goths win was the Roman army's overconfidence and impatience. The Emperor Valens was so eager to win a glorious victory that he refused to wait for his co-emperor, Gratian, to arrive with reinforcements. He launched his attack on a sweltering August day, and his infantry, which had to march for hours in the heat, was exhausted and thirsty by the time they reached the battlefield. They were a bit like a modern sports team that gets so hyped up for a game that they burn themselves out in the first 5 minutes. The Goths, who were more mobile and more disciplined on the day, simply waited for the Romans to tire themselves out before launching their own devastating attack. Historians still argue whether Adrianople was a tactical fluke or if it was a sign of a deeper terminal weakness in the Roman military. Some scholars argue that it was a simple failure of leadership. If Valens had just waited for reinforcements, or if he had been a better commander, the battle could have gone very differently. In this view, the Roman army was still a capable fighting force, but it was let down by its commander. Other historians see Adrianople as the culmination of the trends we've been talking about. The Roman army, with its reliance on foreign soldiers and its loss of tactical superiority, was simply no longer a match for a determined and desperate foe. The Battle of Adrianople, in this view, was the moment the world realized that Rome was not as strong as it used to be. For you, a Roman citizen, the news of the defeat at Adrianople would have been a massive shock. You would have heard the rumors, the stories of the emperor's death, the total destruction of the army. You would have been terrified. The Goths, who were once just a distant threat, were now an armed, angry, and victorious army roaming freely through the Roman heartland. The security you had once felt, the quiet belief that the Roman army would always be there to protect you, was gone. The empire was now a place of fear, a place where the old rules no longer applied. You might have found yourself looking at your own small town and wondering if you were next. The Battle of Adrianople was more than just a defeat. It was a psychological blow from which the empire would never fully recover. The myth of Roman invincibility, which had been a source of stability for centuries, was shattered. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a loud, terrible roar, the sound of a Roman army being annihilated by a barbarian one. The empire was not yet dead, but it was now on borrowed time. The world had changed, and Rome, for all its glory and all its power, was unable to change with it. The devastating defeat at Adrianople was a major wake-up call for the Roman Empire, but it wasn't the final one. In the years following the battle, a new emperor would rise, a man who, for a brief time, would bring a measure of stability back to the empire. We're talking about Theodosius, and his reign is often seen as Theodosius's last stand, a final, flickering moment of a unified Roman Empire before it was divided for good. The mainstream historical fact here is that Theodosius I, also known as Theodosius the Great, was the last emperor to rule over a unified Roman Empire. After the disaster at Adrianople, he was made emperor of the Eastern Empire. He was a brilliant diplomat and a skilled military commander. He didn't try to defeat the Goths outright. He couldn't. Instead, he made a treaty with them, allowing them to settle within the empire's borders as a semi-autonomous group, or foederati. They would serve in the Roman army, but they would still be under their own leaders and their own laws. It was a pragmatic and intelligent solution to a problem that no one else could solve. He also managed to briefly reunify the western and eastern halves of the empire under his rule after a series of civil wars. For a brief, shining moment, the Roman Empire was whole again, from Britain to the Euphrates. Here's a quirky tidbit about Theodosius's reign. He was a devout Christian, and he was the emperor who made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. He issued a series of edicts that outlawed paganism and closed the old pagan temples. The Olympic Games, which had been held for over 1,000 years, were abolished. The Vestal Virgins, who had been tending the sacred fire of Rome for centuries, were disbanded. It was a massive, seismic shift in the religious landscape of the empire. Imagine a modern government outlawing all other religions and making one single faith the law of the land. It was a testament to how much Constantine's convenient conversion had changed the empire's soul. The old gods, which had been fading for a long time, were now officially dead. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's treaty with the Goths was a brilliant act of diplomacy, or if it was a fatal concession that allowed a hostile armed group to become a permanent presence within the empire's borders. Some scholars argue that Theodosius had no other choice. The Roman army was too weak to fight the Goths, and he made the best of a bad situation. In this view, he was a pragmatic leader who understood that the empire needed to find a new way to live with its barbarian neighbors. Other historians see the treaty as a fatal mistake. They argue that by allowing the Goths to settle within the empire as a distinct entity, he created a state within a state, a ticking time bomb that would eventually explode. It's a debate that gets to the heart of the long-term consequences of short-term solutions. For you, a Roman citizen, Theodosius's reign would have been a mixed bag. You would have felt a sense of relief that the civil wars and the Gothic conflicts had ended. The empire was, for a moment, at peace. But you would also have seen the old ways of life slowly disappearing. The old temples, which had been a part of your life for centuries, were now being closed and sometimes even torn down. You would have seen the Goths, with their strange customs and language, living in Roman towns, and you would have felt a sense of unease. The old, distinct lines between Roman and barbarian were now blurring, and it was hard to know what the future would hold. Theodosius's reign was a final, glorious sunset for the unified Roman Empire. He was a good ruler, and he brought a measure of stability back to a chaotic world. But his actions, both the division of the empire at his death and the integration of the Goths, set the stage for the final act of the Western Roman Empire's decline. He was a brilliant emperor, but he was also the last emperor of a united Rome. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a low, mournful sound, the sound of a great empire's final, fading moment of unity. The world was about to change again, and this time the division would be permanent. Theodosius the Great's reign was a final, brilliant flash of unity, a moment where it seemed the empire might be saved. But as we've seen, the empire's problems were too vast and too deep-seated for one man to solve. The final act of his life, and the first act of the empire's final decline, was his last will and testament. This is where we look at splitting the empire for good, a decision that made the division between the eastern and western halves of the Roman world official and permanent. The mainstream historical fact here is that when Theodosius died in 395 AD, divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius and Honorius. Arcadius, the older son, was given the Eastern Empire, and Honorius, the younger, was given the Western. It was a seemingly logical decision, a way to ensure a clear line of succession and to allow the two halves of the empire to be governed more effectively. but it was also a fateful one. The two halves of the empire would never again be truly reunited. The division was a final, formal acknowledgement of a reality that had been building for over 100 years. The two halves of the empire had become different in almost every way, culturally, linguistically, and economically. Here's a quirky tidbit about Honorius, the first emperor of the Western Roman Empire. He was a deeply incompetent man who, according to the historian Procopius, was more interested in his pet chickens than in the fate of his empire. In one famous story, he was told that Rome had perished, and he was distraught, thinking that his favorite chicken, named Roma, had died. It's a hilarious, if probably apocryphal, story, and it illustrates a deeper truth. The leaders of the Western Empire were, for the most part, simply not up to the task of ruling. They were weak, indecisive, and often controlled by powerful generals, both Roman and barbarian. The Eastern Empire, on the other hand, was ruled by a series of more competent and more powerful emperors. The split created a fundamental imbalance that would have a devastating effect on the West. Historians still argue whether this final split was a deliberate act of suicide for the Western Empire, or if it was a necessary and logical conclusion to a long, slow process of divergence. Some scholars argue that Theodosius, by dividing the empire, sealed the fate of the West. He gave his stronger, more competent son the richer, more defensible half of the empire, and his weaker, less competent son the poorer, more exposed half. In this view, it was a deliberate choice to let the West slowly wither away while the East survived. Other historians argue that the split was simply an acknowledgement of reality. The two halves of the empire were already so different that they were, for all intents and purposes, two separate states. The formal division was just a way to make the administration of both halves more efficient. For you, a Roman citizen living in the West, this split would have been a profoundly unsettling event. You would have felt a sense of abandonment. The powerful, wealthy Eastern Empire, with its magnificent new capital of Constantinople, was now a separate entity. The armies, the resources, and the best people were all heading east. You were now living in a poorer, weaker, and more exposed part of the empire. The Goths, who were already living within the borders of the empire, were now a more pressing threat. The old sense of a single, unified Roman world was gone, replaced by a new, more fragmented reality. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, hollow sound, the sound of an empire being formally divided and then simply letting go. The split was not a single event, but a culmination of a long, slow process. The founding of Constantinople, the economic shifts, the barbarian migrations, all of these things had been pulling the empire apart for 100 years. Theodosius's decision was simply the final official act of a process that had been a long time in the making. The Eastern Empire would go on to survive for another 1,000 years, becoming the magnificent Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire, however, would only last for another 80 years. The slow, gentle decline was now a rapid, accelerating one, and the end was coming, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a quiet, mournful division of a once great empire. After the formal split of the Roman Empire into two halves, the western half, with its weak emperors and precarious position, was now on its own. It was a poorer, less defensible entity, and it was about to face a new, terrifying threat. We're going to talk about the sack of Rome, a catastrophic event that proved to the entire world that the Eternal City was, In fact, not so eternal after all. The mainstream historical fact is that in 410 AD, the city of Rome was sacked by a Gothic army led by a brilliant general named Alaric. You remember the Goths, the ones who were mistreated by Roman officials and then defeated the Roman army at Adrianople. Well, they were still a presence in the empire, and they were still a problem. Alaric, their leader, was a charismatic and ambitious man who was a Roman general one day and a barbarian king the next. He led his army to the gates of Rome, and after a short siege, the city's gates were opened by a few sympathetic Goths who were living inside the city. For 3 days, Alaric's Goths plundered Rome. They took gold, silver, and other valuables. They ransacked the city, but they did not, for the most part, burn it or destroy its magnificent monuments. It was a sack, not a razing. Here's a quirky tidbit about the sack of Rome. Alaric's Goths were, in many ways, more civilized than the Romans they were plundering. Alaric was a Christian, and he had his men spare the churches and the people who took refuge in them. He gave explicit orders not to burn the city or to harm the people. The sack was, in a strange way, a disciplined affair. The Goths were not just a wild, barbarian horde. They were a sophisticated. It's a reminder that the line between Roman and barbarian was, by this point, incredibly blurry. A modern equivalent might be if an army of mercenaries, hired by a nation, turned on that nation after not being paid for their services. They would be soldiers, not a wild mob. Historians still argue whether the sack of Rome in 410 was a death knell for the Western Empire, or if it was simply a symbolic event with no long-term political or economic consequences. Some scholars argue that the sack was a turning point. It shattered the psychological dominance of Rome. The city that had been the heart of the empire for over 1,000 years, a city that was a symbol of unshakable power, was now vulnerable. In this view, the sack of Rome was not just a military event. It was a psychological one that proved to the entire world that the old empire was fading away. Other historians argue that the sack was a minor event. Rome had long since ceased to be the political capital of the Western Empire, and the city's economic importance had been in decline for centuries. In this view, the sack was a symbolic event, but it had little to do with the actual grinding decline of the Western Roman Empire. For you, a Roman citizen, the news of the sack of Rome would have been devastating, no matter where you lived. You would have heard the stories. The city you had once seen as the center of the world was now a place of ruin and desolation. The old monuments, the great forums, the magnificent temples, all of them, were now in the hands of the barbarians. The old sense of Roman power, the quiet belief that nothing could ever happen to Rome, was gone. The empire was now a place of fear, a place where the old rules no longer applied. You would have looked at your own small town and wondered, if Rome can fall, what hope is there for us? The sack of Rome was not the end of the Western Roman Empire, not by a long shot, but it was a profound psychological blow. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a loud, mournful sound, the sound of a great city being plundered by its enemies. The empire was not yet dead, but it was now a ghost of its former self, a hollowed-out shell of a once great power. The world was changing, and Rome, for all its glory and all its power, was unable to change with it. The sack of Rome in 410 AD, while a profound psychological blow, was not the end of the Western Roman Empire. It was a sign of things to come, a kind of dress rehearsal for the final collapse. But as the empire struggled to deal with the internal and external threats, A new, and in many ways more terrifying force was on the horizon. We're going to talk about the Hunnic threat under Attila, a time when a ruthless, brilliant, and incredibly terrifying nomadic warrior would put the fear of God into both the Romans and their barbarian neighbors. The mainstream historical fact here is that in the mid-5th century, the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia, had established a massive empire in Central and Eastern Europe under the leadership of a man named Attila. He was a brilliant military commander, a ruthless diplomat, and a man who was, by all accounts, utterly terrifying. He led a series of devastating campaigns, first against the Eastern Roman Empire, and then against the West. He didn't just want to conquer territory, he wanted tribute. He would demand massive sums of gold from the Eastern Roman Emperor, and he would threaten to invade the Western Empire if they didn't pay him off. The Huns were like a terrifying ancient protection racket, and Attila was the best in the business. Here's a quirky tidbit about Attila. He was so feared that the Romans and other tribes referred to him as the scourge of God. They believed he was sent by God to punish them for their sins. When Attila's army would approach a city, the people would often simply flee, knowing that resistance was futile. He didn't just win battles. He created a sense of psychological terror that was unmatched in the ancient world. The Huns were not a civilized people in the Roman sense. They were a nomadic, equestrian people who lived on horseback, and they were masters of the composite bow. Their tactics were fast, brutal, and utterly devastating to the slow-moving Roman armies. They were, for all intents and purposes, the ancient world's version of a special forces team, and they were a complete and total terror to everyone in their path. Historians still argue whether Attila was a brilliant military genius, or if his success was a result of the extreme weakness of the Roman and Germanic states he was fighting against. Some scholars argue that Attila was a military innovator, a man who understood the power of psychological warfare and who was able to forge a disparate group of tribes into a single, unified, and terrifying army. In this view, his success was a testament to his personal genius. Other historians argue that Attila was a product of his time. The Roman Empire was so weak and so internally fractured that any powerful, charismatic leader could have taken advantage of the situation. In this view, Attila was simply a man who was in the right place at the right time, a man who was able to take advantage of a world that was already falling apart. For you, a Roman citizen, the news of Attila's approach would have been the most terrifying news you could possibly imagine. You would have heard the stories of the cities he had burned, the people he had slaughtered. You would have looked at the walls of your own town and wondered if they would be enough to hold off an army that seemed to come out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The fear of the Huns was a powerful, all-consuming thing. It was a fear that transcended the political and military turmoil of the empire. It was a primal fear, the fear of a force of nature, a force that seemed to have no interest in land or titles, but only in destruction and plunder. The Hunnic threat was a final, devastating blow to an empire that was already on its knees. It forced the Romans to make alliances with their old enemies, the Goths, to fight a common foe. The old enemies were now the new allies, and the old order was gone forever. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a high-pitched, terrifying sound, the sound of a Hunnic battle horn, and it was a sound that would echo through the years, a final, terrifying reminder that the old empire was now a thing of the past. The end was not yet here, but it was coming, and it was coming on a horse. with a bow and arrow, and with a terrifying, destructive fury. The Hunnic threat under Attila, while terrifying, was also a temporary one. Attila died in 453 AD, and his empire quickly fell apart. The Western Roman Empire was given a brief reprieve, a moment to catch its breath, but the empire was so weak by this point that the reprieve was only temporary. The final decades of the Western Empire were not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a long, slow, grinding process of decay. We're going to talk about the Western Empire's final decline, a time when the emperors were little more than puppets and the real power rested in the hands of Germanic warlords. The mainstream historical fact here is that in the mid-5th century, the Western Roman emperors were, for the most part, completely powerless. The real power rested in the hands of a few powerful generals. Men like Ricimer, a Suebian general who, for over 16 years, was the de facto ruler of the Western Empire. He would appoint and depose emperors at will. The emperors were simply puppets on a string, and Ricimer was the one pulling the strings. It was a complete reversal of the old Roman order. The generals, who had once been the servants of the state, were now its masters. The emperors were just a convenient fiction, a way to maintain the illusion of a Roman state, while the reality was something entirely different. Here's a quirky tidbit about this era. One of the more famous, or infamous, of these generals was a man named Stilicho. He was a Vandal, a Germanic tribe that was one of Rome's great enemies, but he was also a Roman general who was fiercely loyal to the empire. He was married to the niece of the Emperor Theodosius, and he was the de facto ruler of the Western Empire for over a decade. He was a brilliant commander, and he was the one who, for a time, held the empire together. But his very presence, barbarian general ruling the Roman Empire, was a sign of how far the empire had fallen. He was a good man, and he was loyal, but he was also a barbarian, and the old Roman aristocracy hated him for it. He was eventually executed on trumped-up charges, and with his death, the Western Empire lost its last great defender. The event shows the deep, self-destructive nature of the Roman elite, who were more concerned with racial purity than with the survival of their state. Historians still argue whether the Western Empire's final decline was an inevitable result of its internal weaknesses, or if it was a process that could have been reversed by a few strong, competent leaders. Some scholars argue that by the mid-5th century, the empire was already so weak that nothing could have saved it. The economic base was gone, the military was a collection of mercenaries, and the political system was in a state of terminal decay. In this view, the decline was an inevitable process, and the powerful generals who ruled were simply the men who were best suited to a broken world. Other historians argue that the decline was not inevitable. They point to men like Stilicho, who, for a time, were able to hold the empire together. They argue that if the Roman elite had been more willing to embrace these men and to work with them, the empire might have been able to survive. It's a debate that gets to the heart of the role of human agency in shaping historical events. For you, a Roman citizen, the final decline of the Western Empire would have been a profoundly unsettling thing. You would have seen a series of child emperors and puppet rulers. You would have heard the names of Germanic generals who, for all intents and purposes, were the real rulers of the state. You would have seen the old Roman institutions, the Senate, the bureaucracy, the army, all of them becoming hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone. You were no longer a citizen of Rome. You were a subject of a Germanic warlord who just happened to be living in the remnants of the Roman Empire. The final decline of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event. It was a long, slow, grinding process of decay, a gradual fading of an old order. The emperors were still there. The Senate was still there. The old Roman names were still there. But the power, the money, and the purpose were all gone. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low whisper, the sound of a once great empire slowly fading into a new, darker age. The end was not yet here, but it was coming, and it was coming with a whimper, not a bang. The Western Roman Empire was a fragile, dying state, and it was about to face a new, and in many ways, more brutal assault than the one it had endured decades earlier. You remember the sack of Rome in 410 AD, when the Goths, under Alaric, plundered the city but left its inhabitants and most of its monuments unharmed. Well, this time it's going to be different. We're going to talk about the sack of Rome, an event that demonstrated just how far the city had fallen and how much the empire had decayed. The mainstream historical fact here is that in 455 AD, a different Germanic tribe, the Vandals, led by their king Gazaric, sacked the city of Rome. The Vandals were a seafaring people who had established a powerful kingdom in North Africa, a region that was once the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. They had a powerful fleet, and they used it to raid the coasts of Italy and Sicily. When the Roman emperor, at the time, a man named Petronius Maximus, was killed by a mob, the Vandals saw their opportunity. They sailed to Rome, and for 14 days, they plundered the city. Unlike the Goths, they were far more systematic and far more brutal. They were not just looking for gold and silver. They were looking for anything of value, and they weren't afraid to tear down monuments and statues to get it. They even took the sacred Jewish treasures that had been brought to Rome by the Emperor Titus after the sack of Jerusalem centuries earlier. The second sack of Rome was not a disciplined affair. It was a brutal, systematic, and incredibly thorough plundering of a once great city. Here's a quirky tidbit about this event. Before the Vandals entered the city, Pope Leo I, the Bishop of Rome, went out to meet King Gazaric and pleaded with him to spare the city. Gazaric agreed to a few conditions. He would not burn the city to the ground, and he would not slaughter its inhabitants. He kept his word, for the most part, but the plundering was total. The fact that the Bishop of Rome, and not the Roman Emperor, was the one who was negotiating with the barbarian king is a profound indicator of how much power had shifted. The Roman government was so weak that the church was now the only institution that could protect the city. It's a bit like a modern mayor having to negotiate with a gang leader for the safety of his city. The mayor has the title, but the gang leader has the power. Historians still argue whether the second sack of Rome was a minor event in the grand scheme of things, or if it was a final, debilitating blow to the Western Empire. Some scholars argue that by 455 AD, the Western Empire was already so weak that the sack of Rome was just a minor setback. The empire had long since lost its economic and military power, and the sack of the city, while a terrible event, did not fundamentally change the trajectory of the empire's decline. Other historians argue that the second sack of Rome was a final psychological blow. The systematic nature of the plundering, the sheer brutality of it, proved that the city was no longer a symbol of power and permanence. It was just a place, a city that could be plundered and then left to its own devices. In this view, the sack of Rome was the final, brutal proof that the old world was gone forever. For you, a Roman citizen, The news of the second sack of Rome would have been devastating. You remember the first sack, and you remember the stories of how the Goths had been, in their own way, merciful. But this time, it was different. You would have heard the stories of the statues being torn down, the gold and silver being taken, the sheer, systematic destruction of a once great city. The hope that the empire might one day recover was gone. The city you had once seen as the center of the world was now a place of ruin and desolation, a hollowed-out shell of its former self. You would have looked at your own small town and wondered, not if you were next, but when. The second sack of Rome was not the end of the Western Roman Empire. That would still be a few decades away, but it was a final, profound, psychological blow. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, hollow sound. The sound of a once great city being systematically plundered and then left to its own devices. The world was changing, and Rome, for all its glory and all its power, was unable to change with it. The second sack of Rome was a final, brutal sign that the old order was gone forever. But even after this devastating blow, the Western Roman Empire didn't simply vanish overnight. It faded away over a few more decades, a long, slow, and in many ways, an incredibly boring process. We're now at the very end of the line, and we're going to talk about the end of the Western emperors, a time when the last emperor was a boy and his deposition was a quiet, almost unremarked upon event. The mainstream historical fact here is that the last Western Roman emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustulus. His name is a delightful, if slightly depressing, historical footnote. He was named Romulus after the founder of Rome, and Augustulus, which means Little Augustus, after the first emperor. It's a bit like naming a modern child after a famous historical figure, and then giving them a cutesy nickname. For all intents and purposes, he was a powerless figurehead. His reign was short, a little over a year, and it came to an end in 476 AD, when Orestes was killed in a revolt led by a Germanic general named Odoacer. Odoacer, a man who had more power than any Roman emperor, simply deposed the boy emperor and sent him into retirement. It was a remarkably quiet and peaceful end to a 1,000-year-old tradition. Here's a quirky tidbit about this event. The date for 76 AD, which is often taught in school as the fall of Rome, wasn't really seen as a big deal at the time. The people living in Rome and the other cities of the empire were so used to seeing emperors come and go. It's a bit like a modern historian looking back at a business that has been slowly going out of business for decades and picking a single day to say, this is the day the business died. The truth is, the business had been dead for a long, long time. Some scholars argue that the deposition of Romulus Augustulus was a watershed moment. It was the formal, official end of the Western Roman Empire. The line of Roman emperors, which had begun with Augustus, was finally broken. In this view, the date for 76 AD is a crucial marker that shows a clear break between the ancient world and the medieval world, and that the Germanic kingdoms that arose in the West were, in many ways, a continuation of Roman society, just under new management. They argue that the Western Empire didn't fall so much as it transformed. For you, a Roman citizen, the end of the Western emperors would have been a strangely quiet and anticlimactic affair. You would have heard the news, and you would have probably thought, oh, another one. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a silent one, the sound of a once great empire simply ceasing to be. The end of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event. It was the culmination of all the trends we've been talking about. The political chaos, the economic squeeze, the barbarian invasions. The military weakness, all of these things came together to create a world where a Roman emperor was no longer a necessary or even a useful institution. The final end of the Western Roman Empire was not a tragedy. It was a quiet, dignified, and almost boring end to a very long story. The world was changing, and Rome, for all its glory and all its power, was unable to change with it. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD wasn't the end of Roman society in the West. It was the end of Roman emperors in the West. The man who deposed him, the Germanic general Odoacer. We're going to talk about Odoacer and a new kind of kingdom, a time when the Western Empire was not replaced by a wild barbarian horde, but by a new kind of state, a state that was a strange and fascinating hybrid of Roman and Germanic traditions. The diadem too, the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople. He asked the Eastern emperor to recognize him not as an emperor, but as a ruler or patrician of Italy. The Eastern emperor, who had no real power in the West anyway, agreed. Odoacer then ruled Italy for almost 15 years, and he ruled it not as a barbarian king, but as a Roman official. He kept the Roman Senate. He maintained the Roman laws. A Roman ruler, just one who happened to be from a Germanic tribe. Here's a quirky tidbit about Odoacer's rule. He was a great admirer of Roman culture and Roman institutions. He kept the Roman bureaucracy. He kept the Roman tax system, and he even used the Roman military titles. The Senate of Rome, which was just a hollowed-out shell of its former self, still met and made pronouncements. The people of Rome, who had been so used to seeing emperors come and go, were now ruled by a man who respected their traditions and their way of life. It's a bit like a modern-day takeover, where the new boss decides to keep the old company name and all the old employees, but he's the one who's really running the show. It was a strange and fascinating fusion of Roman and Germanic traditions, a new kind of state for a new kind of world. Historians still argue whether Odoacer's kingdom was a final, graceful end to the Roman Empire, or if it was simply a more polite form of barbarian conquest. They point to the fact that the Roman way of life continued in Italy for a long time after 476 AD, and that the Germanic rulers who followed him, like the Ostrogoths, were also, in their own way, great admirers of Roman culture. Other historians argue that Odoacer's rule was a simple conquest. He was a Germanic warlord with a powerful army, and he took control of Italy by force. The fact that he respected Roman institutions and Roman culture was a sign of his pragmatism, not his benevolence. In this view, the end of the Roman Empire was not a transformation, but a final, brutal conquest, a final act of a long and bloody story. For you, a Roman citizen, Odoacer's rule would have been a strange and unsettling thing. You were now ruled by a man who was not a Roman, but who respected your Roman traditions, the old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world was gone, but it was replaced by a new, if more tenuous, sense of stability. You were now living in a world that was a strange and fascinating mix of Roman and Germanic traditions. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new kind of world being born from the ashes of the old. The establishment of Odoacer's kingdom was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of a new one. The Western Roman Empire was gone, but its legacy was not. The law, the language, the the traditions, all of these things would continue to exist, just under a different kind of rule. The end of the Roman Empire was not a final, dramatic crash. It was a long, slow, and in many ways, a peaceful transformation, a gradual fading of one kind of society into another. The world was changing, and Rome, for all its glory and all its power, was unable to change with it. The Western Roman Empire was gone, and its lands were now ruled by a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. But while the West was slowly fading into a new, medieval reality, the eastern half of the empire, with its magnificent new capital of Constantinople, was not only surviving, it was thriving. This is where we look at the Eastern Empire soldiers on, and we see how the eastern half, with its new capital and wealth, not only survived the turmoil, but went on to last for another 1,000 years. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later be known as the Byzantine Empire, survived the fall of the West and continued to exist for over 1,000 years, until its final conquest by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. It was a different kind of empire. It was Greek-speaking, it was deeply Christian, and it was much more centralized and wealthy than its Western counterpart. Its capital, Constantinople, was a magnificent, heavily fortified city that was almost impossible to conquer. It was at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and it controlled the lucrative trade routes between the two. While the West was slowly decaying, the East was building a new, vibrant, and powerful civilization. Here's a quirky tidbit about the Byzantine Empire. They were obsessed with bureaucracy and ceremony. The imperial court in Constantinople was a labyrinth of rituals and complex titles. There was a grand domestic, a master of offices, and a whole host of other officials with incredibly specific and incredibly long titles. The emperor was not just a ruler. He was a kind of living god, and his court was a reflection of the heavenly court. It's a bit like a modern-day corporation that's so focused on titles and internal politics that it forgets to do any actual work. But for the Byzantines, this ceremony and bureaucracy were a source of stability. It was a way to maintain the illusion of a Roman state, even as the world around them was changing. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire, or if it was a new Greek civilization that simply inherited the Roman name. Some scholars argue that the Byzantines were, in all important respects, Roman. They saw themselves as Romans. They upheld Roman law, and they maintained Roman traditions. They were the true successors to Augustus and Constantine. In this view, the fall of Rome was not a fall at all, but a relocation of its center of power. Other historians argue that the Byzantines were a different civilization entirely. They spoke Greek, not Latin. Their religion was a new Greek form of Christianity, and their culture was a unique fusion of Roman, Greek, and Middle Eastern traditions. In this view, the Byzantine Empire was a new civilization that simply arose in the wake of the old. For you, a Roman citizen in the West, the survival of the Eastern Empire would have been a strange and bittersweet thing. You would have heard the stories of the wealth and power of Constantinople. You would have seen the magnificent Byzantine coins, which were far more valuable than the debased coins of the Western emperors. You would have felt a sense of pride that a part of the old empire was still surviving, but you would also have felt a sense of abandonment. The East was a different world, a different language, and a different culture. It was Roman, but it wasn't your Rome. The slow, gentle hum of decline in the West was now a distant, low murmur, a faint sound from a different world. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire is a testament to the idea that the fall of Rome was not a universal event. The East, with its wealth, its defensible capital, and its more centralized government, was able to weather the storm that destroyed the West. The empire was not yet dead. It had simply shifted, and it would continue to exist in a different form for another 1,000 years. The slow, gentle decline of the West was now a historical footnote, a story told in the magnificent, vibrant, and incredibly bureaucratic world of Byzantium. While the Western Roman Empire was gone, and its lands were now ruled by a new class of Germanic kings, the old Roman way of life did not simply disappear. The legacy of Rome was too deep and too profound to be erased by a few hundred years of barbarian invasions. One of the most enduring legacies was the law, the one thing that had held the empire together for over 1,000 years. We're going to talk about the long shadow of Roman law, and we'll see how the legal principles of the Roman Empire continued to influence the new kingdoms that arose in the West. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Germanic rulers who took over the Western Roman Empire did not simply replace Roman law with their own. They were, for the most part, great admirers of Roman law. Was a powerful and useful tool for governing a large and diverse population. Saw the value in a system that had been refined for centuries. They were not just a wild, barbarian horde. They were pragmatic rulers who saw the value in an old, established system of law. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. One of the most important legal codes of the late Roman Empire was the Theodosian Code. This code was so important that it was still being used by the new Germanic kings to govern their Roman subjects. Imagine a modern business, after a corporate takeover, continuing to use the old company's policy handbook for decades. It's a testament to the power and the usefulness of Roman law. The new rulers might have had the power, but the old law still had the authority. Historians still argue whether the continuation of Roman law was a sign of the Germanics' respect for Roman civilization, or if it was simply a pragmatic choice to govern a population that they didn't understand. Some scholars argue that the Germanic kings were so impressed by Roman civilization that they wanted to emulate it. They saw themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire, and they wanted to rule their new kingdoms in the Roman way. In this view, the continuation of Roman law was a sign of respect and a testament to the enduring power of Roman ideas, and they needed a system of law that the Roman population would respect and understand. In this view, the continuation of Roman law was a simple, pragmatic choice, a necessary evil for a ruler who wanted to maintain order. You were no longer a citizen of Rome, but you were still a subject of Roman law. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone, but it was replaced by a new, more tenuous sense of stability. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new kind of world being born from the ashes of the old. A world that still respected the old Roman way of doing things. The continuation of Roman law was not a miracle. It was a testament to the power of a good idea. The Roman legal system was a profound and enduring legacy, and it would continue to influence the legal systems of Europe for centuries to come. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Roman civilization. The legacy of the Roman Empire was not just in its laws, it was also in its physical infrastructure. The Romans were magnificent engineers, builders of roads, aqueducts, and bridges that were built to last. While the political entity of the Western Roman Empire was gone, its physical presence continued to exist for centuries. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Roman road network, a vast and intricate system of over 50,000 miles of paved roads, continued to be used for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. The old Roman saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was no longer true, but the roads themselves were still there, a physical reminder of a past greatness. Here's a quirky tidbit about Roman engineering: the aqueducts. These magnificent feats of engineering, which brought fresh water to the great cities of the Roman Empire. The Pont du Gard in France, for example, is a magnificent Roman aqueduct that is still a functioning bridge and a popular tourist destination. The Romans were masters of a very simple but incredibly effective technology: gravity. They would build these massive aqueducts with a slight incline, and gravity would do the rest, bringing fresh water from the mountains to the cities. The new Germanic rulers, who were not as skilled in engineering, simply took over the old aqueducts and, in many cases, tried to repair them when they broke down. It's a bit like a modern-day car owner inheriting a magnificent old car that they can't quite fix. They drive it for as long as it works, and when it breaks down, they try their best to fix it. But they can't quite get it to work as well as it used to. Historians still argue whether the long-term survival of Roman engineering was a sign of its brilliance, or if it was a symbol of the new rulers' lack of technical skill. Some scholars argue that the Roman engineers were simply 1,000 years ahead of their time. The roads and aqueducts were so well built that they simply lasted for centuries, a testament to the sheer skill and ingenuity of the Roman people. In this view, the survival of Roman engineering was a sign of its brilliance and its enduring power. Other historians argue that the survival of Roman engineering was a sign of the new rulers' lack of technical skill. They were not builders, they were warriors. They could conquer a city, but they couldn't build a new aqueduct. In this view, the survival of Roman engineering was a symbol of the new world's backwardness and its reliance on the past. For you, a citizen of the New World, the legacy of Roman engineering would have been a strange and comforting thing. You would have seen the magnificent Roman roads and aqueducts every day. You would have used the old Roman roads to travel to the local market, and you would have drunk water that was brought to you by an old Roman aqueduct. The old sense of Roman identity was gone, but the old Roman world was still there, a physical reminder of a past that you were now a part of. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new world that was built on the foundations of the old. The roads, the aqueducts, the bridges, all of these things would continue to exist for centuries, a physical reminder of a past that was not quite gone. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Roman civilization. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the old ideas and the old infrastructure of Rome would continue to exist, just under a different kind of rule. While the Roman Empire as a political entity was gone, the Latin language, which had once been the lingua franca of the entire Western world, continued to exist, and it continued to evolve. We're going to talk about the quiet persistence of Latin, and we'll see how the Roman language slowly, gently transformed into the Romance languages we know today. The mainstream historical fact here is that Latin did not die, it simply changed. In the new Germanic kingdoms that arose in the West, Latin was still the language of the educated elite, the church, and the bureaucracy. The new Germanic rulers, who often could not speak or write Latin, would hire Roman officials to run their governments. The church, which was the most powerful institution in the New World, conducted all of its services in Latin. But the spoken Latin of the common people, which had always been different from the high Latin of the educated elite, began to diverge even more. Over a period of centuries, this so-called vulgar Latin slowly, gently transformed into a host of new languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. The old Roman Empire was not gone. It had simply broken into a host of new linguistic kingdoms. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. The process of linguistic change was a slow and gentle one. It was not a sudden break. A person living in Spain in the 6th century could have probably understood a person living in Italy, and they would have both thought they were speaking Latin. But a few centuries later, the languages would have become so different that they would have been mutually unintelligible. It's a bit like a modern-day English speaker trying to understand the English of Chaucer's time. You can pick out a few words, but the grammar and the sentence structure are so different that it's almost a different language. The old Roman language was not a static, unchanging thing. It was a living, breathing thing that was constantly evolving, and its final evolution was into a host of new, beautiful languages. Historians still argue whether the quiet persistence of Latin was a sign of its power and influence, or if it was simply a result of the new rulers' lack of an alternative. Some scholars argue that Latin was so well established and so deeply ingrained in the culture of the Western world that it was impossible to dislodge. The new Germanic rulers, who often had no written language of their own, were forced to adopt the Roman language and the Roman alphabet. In this view, the persistence of Latin was a sign of its power and its enduring legacy. Other historians argue that the persistence of Latin was a simple result of the new rulers' lack of an alternative. They had to have a language for government, for bureaucracy, and for the church, and Latin was the only one that worked. In this view, the persistence of Latin was a pragmatic choice, not a sign of respect for the old Roman world. For you, a citizen of the New World, the quiet persistence of Latin would have been a comforting thing. You would have heard the old language every day in church. You would have seen it in the old legal documents. You would have used it in your everyday speech, just a slightly different version of it. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone. But the old Roman world was still there, a linguistic reminder of a past that you were now a part of. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new world that was built on the foundations of the old. The continuation of Latin was not a miracle, it was a testament to the power of a good idea. The Roman language was a profound and enduring legacy, and it would continue to influence the languages of Europe for centuries to come. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Roman civilization. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the old ideas and the old language of Rome would continue to exist, just under a different kind of rule. While the Western Roman Empire was gone, and its laws, roads, and language continued to exist in a new form, there was one institution that not only survived the fall of Rome, but actually thrived because of it. We're talking about the Church, and this is where we look at Christianity's role as a unifying force. And we see how the Church stepped into the power vacuum left by the Western Empire and became the most powerful institution in the new medieval world. The mainstream historical fact here is that as the Roman emperors became weaker and weaker, and as the Germanic warlords took over the Church, with its powerful organization and its deep roots in Roman society, became a new source of stability and authority. The bishops of the great cities, especially the Bishop of Rome, who would later become the Pope, were often the most powerful and the most educated men in their cities. They were not just spiritual leaders, they were also political leaders, a kind of new Roman aristocracy. They would negotiate with the barbarian kings, they would organize the defense of the cities, and they would be the ones who would provide the food and the charity that the Roman government could no longer provide. The Church was a powerful, universal institution that was able to transcend the political and military turmoil of the time. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. The Church, in its early days, was not the single monolithic institution we think of today. It was a collection of different bishops and different theological traditions. But as the Roman Empire faded, the Church, with its universal message, became more and more centralized. The Bishop of Rome, who claimed to be the successor of St. Peter, became the leader of the Western Church. The Church's power was not just spiritual, it was also administrative. The bishops would keep records, they would collect tithes, and they would oversee the vast estates of the Church. The Church was, in a way, a new Roman bureaucracy, just one that was run by priests and monks instead of emperors and senators. Historians still argue whether the Church's rise to power was a natural and organic process, or if it was a deliberate act of a powerful institution taking advantage of a weak state. Some scholars argue that the Church was simply the only institution that was able to fill the void left by the fall of Rome. It was the only organization that was truly universal, and it was the only one that had a message that could appeal to both the Roman population and the new Germanic rulers. In this view, the Church's rise to power was a natural and inevitable process. Other historians argue that the Church was a cynical institution that was able to take advantage of a weak state. The Church, in this view, was able to amass a vast amount of wealth and power by presenting itself as the only source of salvation in a chaotic world. It's a debate that gets to the heart of the relationship between a religious institution and the state. For you, a citizen of the New World, the Church would have been a profoundly important institution. You would have looked to the local bishop for guidance, for protection, and for charity. The Church was the only thing that was truly stable in a world of constant political and military turmoil. It was the one place where you could find solace, and it was the one place where you could find a sense of community. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone, but it was replaced by a new, and in many ways, more powerful sense of identity. You were now a Christian. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur. The sound of a new world that was built on the foundations of the old, but with a new, more powerful, and more universal source of authority. The rise of the Church was a powerful and enduring legacy of the fall of Rome. The Church would go on to shape the political, social, and cultural landscape of Europe for over 1,000 years. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Roman civilization. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the old ideas and the old institutions of Rome would continue to exist, just with a new and more powerful spiritual leader. We've explored how Roman law, engineering, and the Christian Church all survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But what about the people who actually took over? The Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Anglo-Saxons were not just a wild, destructive force. They were a people who, in their own way, were profoundly changed by their interaction with the Roman world. We're going to talk about barbarians as new Romans, and we'll see how the new Germanic rulers, who had once been Rome's enemies, became the inheritors and the preservers of the Roman legacy. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Germanic rulers who took over the Western Roman Empire did not simply replace Roman society with their own. They were, in many ways, great admirers of Roman civilization. They adopted Roman titles, they used Roman administrative practices, and they often tried to emulate the Roman way of life. The new Germanic kings, who were often just military leaders, saw the value in the Roman legal system, the Roman tax system, and the Roman bureaucracy. They were not just a wild barbarian horde. They were pragmatic rulers who saw the value in an old, established system of governance. The new kingdoms that arose in the West were not just Germanic kingdoms. They were a strange and fascinating hybrid of Roman and Germanic traditions. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. The new Germanic kings would often take a Roman wife, and their children would be raised with both Roman and Germanic traditions. The new ruling class was a fusion of two different cultures, two different ways of life. The new kings would often build magnificent new palaces that were, in many ways, a testament to their admiration for Roman architecture. The old Roman villas, which had been abandoned by the Roman elite, were often taken over by the new Germanic rulers. They would often try to live in the Roman way, with Roman servants, Roman food, and Roman traditions. It's a bit like a modern-day new money millionaire buying an old, historic home and then trying to fill it with all the modern amenities. They're trying to preserve the old, but they're also trying to make it their own. Historians still argue whether the barbarians' adoption of Roman traditions was a genuine desire to be Roman, or if it was simply a pragmatic way to govern a Roman population. Some scholars argue that the Germanic rulers were so impressed by Roman civilization that they wanted to be Roman. They saw themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire, and they wanted to rule their new kingdoms in the Roman way. In this view, the adoption of Roman traditions was a sign of respect and a testament to the enduring power of Roman ideas. Other historians argue that the Germanic rulers simply had no other choice. They were a small minority ruling a vast Roman population, and they needed a system of governance that the Roman population would respect and understand. In this view, the adoption of Roman traditions was a simple, pragmatic choice, a necessary evil for a ruler who wanted to maintain order. For you, a citizen of the New World, the sight of a new Germanic king ruling from an old Roman palace with Roman officials, Roman laws, and a Roman army would have been a strange and comforting thing. You were now living under a Germanic king, but the world around you was still, in many ways, Roman. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone, but it was replaced by a new, more tenuous sense of stability. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new world that was built on the foundations of the old. The transformation of the barbarians into new Romans was not a miracle. It was a testament to the power of a good idea. The Roman legal system, the Roman administrative practices, and the Roman way of life were so powerful and so useful that they could not be erased. They would continue to exist, just under a different kind of rule. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the end of Roman civilization. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the old ideas and the old institutions of Rome would continue to exist. just with a new and more powerful kind of ruler. We've now come to the end of our long, slow journey. We've seen the Roman Empire at its height, and we've watched it slowly, gently fade away. We've seen the political chaos, the economic squeeze, the barbarian invasions, and the quiet persistence of the Roman legacy. We've seen how the empire didn't fall in a single dramatic moment, but rather transformed over a period of centuries. Our final section is a reflection on that transformation. A look at the end, not as a tragic event, but as a quiet, graceful, and ultimately boring fade to black. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Western Roman Empire didn't end with a cataclysm. It ended with a whimper. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD was not the end of the world. It was a quiet, almost unremarked upon event that, to the people living at the time, was just another Tuesday. The emperors were gone, but the laws, the roads, and the old Roman way of life continued to exist, just under a different kind of rule. The new Germanic rulers, who had once been Rome's enemies, were now its inheritors and its preservers. They were not trying to destroy the Roman world. They were trying to live in it. The end of the Roman Empire was not a tragedy. It was a transformation, a long, slow, and ultimately boring process of one kind of society fading into another. Here's a quirky tidbit about this process. The new Germanic kings would often have a Roman official, a man who had been educated in the old Roman way, run their administration. The new Germanic king might have had the power, but the old Roman official still had the knowledge. It's a bit like a new tech-savvy CEO taking over a company and then keeping all the old, experienced employees. They're trying to use the old system to run their new company. It's a testament to the power of a good idea and to the quiet, almost invisible persistence of the old Roman way of doing things. The end of the Roman Empire was not a final, dramatic crash. It was a long, slow, and in many ways, a peaceful transformation, a gradual fading of one kind of society into another. Historians still argue whether the quiet fade of the Western Roman Empire was a good thing or a bad thing. Some scholars argue that the fall of Rome was a tragedy, a descent into a new, dark age of war, ignorance, and superstition. They point to the loss of Roman technology, Roman law, and Roman literature as a profound and tragic loss for humanity. In this view, the fall of Rome was a bad thing. Other historians argue that the fall of Rome was a good thing. They point to the rise of new, vibrant, and powerful Germanic kingdoms, the rise of the Church as a new source of moral authority, and the rise of new languages and new cultures. In this view, the fall of Rome was not a tragedy. It was a new beginning. For you, a citizen of the New World, the end of the Roman Empire would have been a strange and comforting thing. You were now living in a world that was a strange and fascinating mix of Roman and Germanic traditions. The old sense of Roman identity, the quiet belief that you were a citizen of the most powerful empire in the world, was gone, but it was replaced by a new, more tenuous sense of stability. The slow, gentle hum of decline was now a quiet, low murmur, the sound of a new world that was built on the foundations of the old. The old Roman world was not gone, it had simply changed. The old Roman way of life was not gone. It was still there, just in a different form. The end of the Roman Empire was not a final, dramatic crash. It was a long, slow, and in many ways, a peaceful transformation, a gradual fading of one kind of society into another. And so, we come to the end of our story. We've seen the rise and fall of one of the greatest empires in human history. But we've seen it not as a tragedy, but as a long, slow, and ultimately boring fade to black. The old Roman world is gone, but its legacy is still here, in our laws, in our languages, and in the very roads we drive on. The great Roman dream is over, but the world it created is still with us. So, let's just sit here for a moment and let the final, fading echoes of the Roman Empire wash over us. The noise and chaos of 1,000 years have settled into a quiet hum. The sun has set on the old world, but a new, quieter one has taken its place. The grand story is over, but the gentle, peaceful afterstory is just beginning. Let the soft whispers of history settle in your mind like dust on an ancient road.